Welcome, weary traveler of the modern world. Let the harsh fluorescent lights fade from your memory. Let the constant hum of electronic devices drift away into silence. Tonight, we journey back through the corridors of time to explore the stranger corners of human learning, where knowledge was not simply absorbed from textbooks, but carved into consciousness through experiences that would seem impossible, even dangerous, to our contemporary minds. Imagine yourself setting aside the comfortable assumptions of modern education, the orderly classrooms, the systematic curricula, the gentle progression from simple to complex. We venture instead into ancient halls where learning meant transformation, where students didn't merely study philosophy, but lived it through altered states of consciousness, where the pursuit of wisdom demanded not just intellectual effort, but physical endurance, spiritual discipline, and sometimes the complete dissolution of ordinary reality. Our journey tonight spans millennia and continents, from the sacred mystery schools of ancient Greece, where young minds were systematically altered through carefully administered substances, to the violent streets of Alexandria, where the last great female philosopher met her tragic end. We'll descend into the forgotten depths beneath Moscow's Kremlin, searching for a legendary library that might contain the lost wisdom of Byzantium, and finally ascend to the glittering heights of Versailles, where learning became a performance and knowledge served power in ways both elegant and terrible. These are not stories of gentle academic pursuit, but tales of learning as ordeal, knowledge as transformation, and wisdom as something that could cost everything: sanity, safety, even life itself. Yet in their strangeness, these historical moments reveal profound truths about the human hunger for understanding and the lengths to which seekers of knowledge have always been willing to go. So settle yourself comfortably, let your breathing slow and deepen, and prepare to witness education as our ancestors knew it, not as preparation for career advancement or social mobility, but as a fundamental remaking of human consciousness itself. The ancient world had much to teach about teaching, though its lessons might disturb as much as they illuminate. The rough stone beneath your sleeping mat feels colder than ice as consciousness slowly returns to your exhausted body. Dawn has not yet broken over the sacred precincts of Eleusis, that holy site 18 kilometers west of Athens where humanity's most profound educational experiment has been unfolding for over 1,000 years. Your stomach clenches with familiar hunger, the carefully controlled fasting that is just one element of the systematic preparation designed to strip away everything you thought you knew about the nature of reality. You are 22 years old, born into a prosperous Athenian family that could afford the substantial fees required for initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries. For months, you have anticipated this moment, imagining perhaps that the sacred teachings would be delivered through lectures and discussions, much like the philosophical schools of Athens. You could not have been more mistaken. Here, in the year 421 BCE, education means nothing less than the complete reconstruction of human consciousness through carefully orchestrated physical and psychological ordeals. The air in your stone cell carries the lingering traces of last night's sacred smoke, a complex mixture of herbs and resins that sent your mind spiraling into visions of geometric patterns and divine light. Your mouth tastes metallic, bitter with the residue of the kykeon, the ritual drink that initiates consume throughout their training. Modern scholars would recognize it as barley water contaminated with ergot alkaloids, the same compounds that would later inspire medieval accounts of dancing plagues and demonic possession. But to you, it is simply another element of the mysteries, another step in the process that will either grant you divine wisdom or destroy your sanity entirely. The first sound of morning is not a bell or call to prayer, but the scraping of heavy bronze bars being drawn back from the chamber doors. The Hierophants, those priest-teachers who have guided countless souls through this transformative ordeal, move through the corridors like shadows in their dark robes. Their faces, what little you can see of them in the flickering torchlight, seem carved from marble, expressions of absolute authority and supernatural calm that come from years of witnessing the systematic dismantling of human personality. You rise unsteadily, your limbs trembling from the effects of weeks of carefully controlled malnutrition combined with the psychoactive compounds that have been gradually accumulating in your system. The woolen cloak that serves as your only covering feels rough against skin sensitized by the chemical alterations to your nervous system. Around you, dozens of other initiates perform the same painful awakening. Young men and women from across the Greek world who have committed themselves to this process that promises either enlightenment or madness. The morning purification takes place at the sacred spring, where water flows from underground sources blessed by Demeter herself. The liquid is so cold it feels like liquid ice against your fevered skin, shocking your altered nervous system into a state of hyperawareness. You splash the numbing water over your face and arms, feeling the familiar tingling sensation that has become your constant companion. The ergot alkaloids interacting with the sudden temperature change to create patterns of sensation that seem to carry meaning beyond mere physical response. Your hands shake uncontrollably as you perform the ritual cleansing, and you notice similar tremors affecting your fellow initiates. One young woman near you sways dangerously, her eyes rolled back to show only white, and two hierophants move swiftly to catch her before she can collapse into the sacred pool. These episodes of overwhelming neurological response have become increasingly common as the initiation process intensifies, and you wonder with growing dread whether your own mind will prove capable of surviving what lies ahead. The first meal of the day arrives in wooden bowls that seem to pulse and writhe in your altered vision. The barley gruel mixed with honey appears to move like living tissue, and the herbs scattered throughout taste of metal and earth and something indefinably alien. You consume your portion mechanically, aware that refusal means immediate expulsion from the mysteries, but dreading the inevitable intensification of the visions that will follow. The hierophants watch each initiate carefully during the meal, noting who shows signs of resistance or adverse reaction, making calculations that will determine who proceeds to the next phase and who is quietly removed for their own safety. The morning's instruction takes place in an underground chamber carved from living rock, its walls decorated with frescoes that shift and dance in your altered perception. The geometric patterns seem to pulse with their own life, revealing mathematical relationships and cosmic principles that your rational mind recognizes as hallucinations even as your deeper consciousness accepts them as profound truth. The Hierophant's voice echoes strangely in the stone space, his words about the soul's journey after death taking on layers of meaning that seem to bypass rational understanding entirely. You attempt to take notes on the wax tablet provided for this purpose, but the simple act of forming letters becomes a monumental challenge. Your hands feel disconnected from your body, and the stylus seems to weigh as much as a sword. The letters you manage to scratch appear to glow with their own light, and you find yourself staring in fascination at the curves and lines that seem to contain infinite complexity within their simple forms. Other initiates around you display similar struggles, some weeping quietly as visions overwhelm their capacity to process normal sensory input, others sitting in perfect stillness as if carved from stone. The Hierophant speaks of cosmic cycles, of the eternal return of souls through death and rebirth, of the hidden connections that link all forms of life in an invisible web of meaning. In your ordinary state of consciousness, such concepts might seem abstract, philosophical, but the ergot-altered chemistry of your brain transforms these ideas into direct experience. You feel the pulse of cosmic time, see the threads of connection linking every atom in creation, understand with devastating clarity that individual identity is merely a temporary illusion obscuring deeper truths about the nature of existence. One young man, near the back of the chamber, suddenly stands and begins speaking in tongues, his voice describing crystalline cities floating in seas of light, geometric angels whose wings are made of pure mathematics. The Hierophants allow this ecstatic outburst to continue for several minutes, recognizing it as a sign that the sacred substances are achieving their intended effect. When the young man finally collapses, muttering incoherently about rivers of liquid music, he is gently carried away to a recovery chamber where other initiates who have been overwhelmed by the intensity of their visions wait for their minds to stabilize. The midday meal brings no relief from the escalating intensity of your altered state. The bread served at this meal has been soaked in wine mixed with additional psychoactive compounds, Syrian rue, henbane, and other herbs whose names are sacred secrets known only to the Hierophants. Your perception of time becomes increasingly fluid as you consume this potent mixture. Minutes seem to stretch into hours, while entire conversations appear to occur in the space between heartbeats. The distinction between internal vision and external reality dissolves entirely, leaving you floating in a space where thoughts take physical form and emotions manifest as visible colors. The afternoon session focuses on sacred geometry, the mathematical principles that the mystery schools teach as the underlying structure of both cosmos and consciousness. Under normal circumstances, such lessons would involve careful study of diagrams, logical proofs, and systematic reasoning. But in your current state, these abstract concepts become viscerally real experiences. The golden ratio appears not as a mere number, but as a living force governing the spiral of your inner ear, the branching of your blood vessels, the rhythm of your heartbeat. You see how the same mathematical principles that govern the orbit of planets also determine the structure of seashells, flower petals, and the chambers of the human heart. A simple triangle drawn on the chamber wall reveals itself as a doorway into infinite complexity. You understand, with blinding clarity, how 3 points can represent the divine trinity of thought, feeling, and action, how the angles between them encode the fundamental relationships that govern all existence. Tears stream down your face as you witness the terrible beauty of pure mathematical truth, each drop feeling like liquid wisdom carrying insights too profound for ordinary language to contain. The geometric forms seem to pulse with their own life, revealing connections and patterns that spiral deeper and deeper into realms of meaning your rational mind cannot follow. You watch in fascination as circles transform into spirals, spirals into helixes, helixes into vast mandala-like structures that seem to extend infinitely in all directions. Each transformation carries emotional weight, as if you are witnessing the birth and death of entire universes encoded in the movement of simple lines across stone surfaces. Fellow initiates around you display varying responses to this geometric revelation. Some sit in perfect meditation, their faces radiant with understanding. Others weep uncontrollably, overwhelmed by the beauty and terror of direct mathematical truth. One young woman begins drawing compulsively in the dirt with her fingers, creating elaborate patterns that seem to encode cosmic secrets in their curves and intersections. The Hierophants move among you like shepherds tending their flock, offering gentle guidance to those who seem lost in the labyrinth of sacred knowledge. The most challenging part of your daily education begins in the late afternoon, when you and your fellow initiates are led through narrow stone passages that descend deep beneath the temple complex. The torchlight flickers against walls that seem to breathe in your altered perception, and you hear whispers in languages you don't recognize but somehow understand. These underground chambers, carved from living bedrock by generations of initiates, serve as the setting for the mystery school's most profound teachings, lessons that can only be conveyed through direct experiential participation in the cosmic drama of death and rebirth. In the deepest chamber, lit only by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on carved walls, you encounter the culmination of the day's instruction, a dramatic reenactment of Persephone's abduction by Hades and her eventual return to the world above. But in your hallucinogenic state, this performance transcends mere theater to become viscerally real experience. You feel yourself dying as the young woman portraying Persephone is carried into the symbolic underworld, experiencing the terror of dissolution as your ego structure temporarily collapses under the influence of the sacred drugs. The actors portraying the gods seem to transform before your eyes into actual divine presences. Demeter's anguish at her daughter's disappearance tears through your consciousness like physical pain, her grief manifesting as waves of emotional intensity that leave you gasping for breath. The Earth Goddess's desperate search for her lost child becomes your own search for meaning in a universe suddenly revealed as far stranger and more terrible than anything your ordinary mind could have imagined. When Persephone finally returns from the depths, bringing with her the promise of spring's renewal, you understand with blinding immediacy the cyclical nature of all existence. Birth, death, and rebirth reveal themselves not as abstract concepts, but as the fundamental rhythm governing everything from the seasons of the year to the beating of your own heart. This insight arrives not through intellectual analysis, but as direct knowing, as if the chemical alteration of your brain chemistry has temporarily granted access to forms of understanding normally beyond human reach. But this profound revelation comes at a devastating cost. Several initiates collapse entirely during the performance, their minds unable to integrate such overwhelming spiritual input. You watch in horror as one young woman is carried away, babbling incoherently about serpents made of starlight and oceans of liquid mathematics. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of ecstasy and terror, seem to reflect visions of realities too alien for human consciousness to safely contain. You wonder if this will be your own fate, to gain divine knowledge at the price of human sanity. The evening meal represents the day's final ordeal, a communion feast of bread soaked in wine mixed with the most potent psychoactive compounds the mystery schools possess. By this point in your initiation, your ordinary sense of self has been so thoroughly dissolved that you exist in a state of pure receptivity, open to cosmic influences that would normally be filtered out by the rational mind's defensive barriers. The Hierophant who leads this final ceremony speaks of the soul's immortality, but his words reach you not as philosophical concepts, but as direct experiential truth written in the very structure of your temporarily transformed consciousness. You understand, with a clarity that feels like looking directly into the sun, that everything you previously accepted as reality was merely shadow projected on the wall of Plato's famous cave. The physical world reveals itself as a pale reflection of higher dimensional realms populated by archetypal forms and divine intelligences. You see the invisible threads connecting all living beings, feel the pulse of the cosmic heart beating in perfect synchronization with your own frantically racing pulse. The food you consume seems to dissolve directly into your bloodstream, bypassing normal digestive processes to flood your system with compounds that push your altered state to its absolute limits. Colors become audible, sounds acquire texture and weight, and thoughts manifest as visible geometric forms that dance through the air around your head. Fellow initiates appear as columns of colored light, their individual personalities temporarily dissolved into pure energy patterns that pulse and shift with their emotional states. As the ceremony concludes and you are led to your sleeping chamber, that same cold stone cell where this impossible day began, walking feels like floating through liquid dream space. The narrow corridors seem to stretch infinitely in all directions, and the simple act of placing one foot in front of the other requires intense concentration. Your guide, one of the younger Hierophants, appears sometimes as a normal human being, sometimes as a pillar of golden fire, sometimes as a mathematical equation walking on two legs. Your sleeping chamber, barely large enough for your thin straw mattress, becomes a universe unto itself as you collapse onto the rough bedding. Sleep seems impossible as your mind continues to race with visions and insights, but the distinction between waking and dreaming has long since ceased to have any meaning. Closing your eyes brings no darkness, only kaleidoscopic displays of color and form that pulse with significance beyond ordinary language. You drift in and out of consciousness, unable to tell whether the geometric angels you perceive are dream visions or direct perception of normally invisible spiritual realities. Conversations with divine beings seem to occur in languages made of pure mathematics, while your own thoughts take the form of elaborate architectural structures that build themselves from crystallized concepts and emotional resonances. This is only your first day in a process that will continue for weeks, each day bringing more intense chemical alterations, deeper psychological dismantling, and ever more overwhelming spiritual revelations. Many initiates don't survive the complete course, some driven permanently insane by visions too powerful for human minds to integrate, others suffering complete psychological breakdown as their ego structures dissolve beyond any possibility of reconstruction. You understand now, with growing horror and fascination, that you have committed yourself to an educational process from which there may be no return unchanged. The comfortable, familiar person you were this morning no longer exists. That innocent identity has been systematically dismantled through sacred chemistry and divine theater. What will eventually emerge from this chrysalis of consciousness transformation remains terrifyingly uncertain. As you lie on your stone bed, still feeling the sacred compounds coursing through your bloodstream like liquid fire, you grasp the profound difference between ancient and modern approaches to education. Knowledge, in the mystery schools, is not something external that you acquire through study. It is something you become through systematic destruction of everything you previously assumed about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human identity itself. The person who will eventually leave this place, if indeed you survive the complete initiation, will carry within them experiential knowledge of realms beyond ordinary perception, direct understanding of cosmic principles that can only be glimpsed through chemical dissolution of normal consciousness barriers. But the price of such knowledge is nothing less than the complete reconstruction of human personality, a process that leaves some initiates touched by divine wisdom and others permanently shattered by contact with realities too alien for mortal minds to safely contain. Tomorrow will bring even deeper journeys into these sacred realms, more intense chemical alterations, and further systematic erosion of the boundaries between self and cosmos. You wonder, in the few moments of clarity remaining before the drugs carry your consciousness into regions beyond ordinary thought, whether the wisdom gained through such extreme methods can possibly justify the terrible risks involved in its acquisition. The ancient mystery schools offer no gentle introduction to cosmic truth, no gradual preparation for expanded consciousness. Here, enlightenment comes like lightning, sudden, overwhelming, and potentially devastating to anyone not strong enough to survive direct contact with the electrical fire of divine knowledge. As the sacred mysteries of Eleusis fade into the mists of memory, our journey through history's strangest educational landscapes carries us forward through time to the sun-drenched marble halls of Alexandria, that jewel of the ancient Mediterranean where learning once flourished under the protection of enlightened rulers and curious minds gathered from across the known world. Here, in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Christian era, we encounter a figure whose very existence challenges every assumption about gender, power, and the pursuit of knowledge in antiquity. Picture, if you will, the early morning hours of a day in the year 415 CE. The Mediterranean sun casts long shadows across the marble columns of what remains of Alexandria's great library, that legendary institution which once housed the accumulated wisdom of centuries, but now stands diminished, its treasures scattered or destroyed by the rising tide of religious fervor sweeping across the Roman world. In a modest but elegant house not far from the ancient Serapeum, a woman of 55 years adjusts the white linen robes that mark her scholarly station and prepares for what will be the final lecture of her extraordinary life. Her name is Hypatia, and she represents something that should not, by all the conventions of her age, have been possible to exist. In a world where women are expected to remain silent in public spaces, she speaks with authority about the most complex mathematical theorems. In an era when feminine virtue is measured by domestic submission, she commands the respect of governors and philosophers. In a time when Christian orthodoxy increasingly views pagan learning with suspicion, she continues to teach the ancient wisdom of geometry, astronomy, and metaphysical philosophy to students who travel from across the empire to learn at her feet. The story of how such an anomaly came to exist begins some 35 years earlier, in a household unlike any other in Alexandria. Her father, Theon, held the distinction of being the last recorded member of the Museum of Alexandria, that ancient institution dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge under the patronage of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Born around 360 CE into this environment of scrolls and scholarship, instruments and observations, Hypatia spent her childhood surrounded by the physical remnants of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements. While other girls of her social class learned the arts of household management, textile production, and the subtle skills required to navigate the complex world of marriage and family politics, Hypatia was guided through the intricacies of Euclidean geometry, the astronomical observations of Ptolemy, and the metaphysical speculations of Plato and his followers. Her father, recognizing in his daughter an intellect that surpassed even his own considerable capabilities, chose to violate every social convention of their time by providing her with an education typically reserved for the most promising young men. The daily rhythm of Hypatia's early education followed patterns established centuries earlier by the scholars of the museum. She would rise before dawn to observe the movements of stars and planets, learning to calculate their positions with mathematical precision and to construct the complex instruments required for accurate astronomical observation. The astrolabe, that ingenious device which compressed the entire celestial sphere onto a flat bronze disk, held no mysteries for her clever fingers. She mastered the construction of armillary spheres, those beautiful skeletal models of the cosmos that allowed observers to predict eclipses and trace the wandering paths of planets across the star-filled dome of night. Her mornings were devoted to mathematics, that queen of sciences which the ancient Greeks recognized as the foundation of all reliable knowledge about the physical universe. Under her father's patient guidance, she worked through the logical proofs of Euclid's Elements, learning not merely to accept geometric theorems as true, but to understand the reasoning that made their truth inevitable. She studied the conic sections analyzed by Apollonius, those elegant curves that emerge when a plane intersects a cone at various angles, ellipses, parabolas, and hyperbolas that would later prove essential to understanding planetary motion and the flight of projectiles. But Theon understood that mathematics alone, however beautiful and precise, could not provide complete wisdom about the nature of existence. And so Hypatia's afternoons were spent in philosophical study, exploring the metaphysical teachings that attempted to explain how mathematical order related to cosmic harmony, how geometric relationships might reflect deeper truths about the structure of reality itself. She read Plato's dialogues with their profound investigations into the nature of knowledge, truth, and justice. She studied the works of Plotinus, who had developed Plato's insights into a comprehensive system explaining how all reality emanated from a single, ineffable source of being. These were not merely academic exercises, but spiritual disciplines designed to transform the students' entire understanding of themselves and their relationship to the cosmos. Ancient philosophy, as practiced in Alexandria's scholarly circles, was never merely theoretical but always practical, concerned not just with understanding truth, but with living in accordance with truth's demands. Hypatia learned to see mathematical relationships as reflections of cosmic harmony, geometric forms as shadows cast by eternal archetypes, and philosophical reasoning as a means of purifying the soul and preparing it for union with the divine source from which all being flows. By her 30th year, Hypatia had not only mastered these traditional areas of study, but had begun to surpass her teachers in both understanding and innovation. Her commentaries on mathematical texts revealed insights that had escaped previous scholars, and her philosophical lectures drew audiences far beyond the usual circle of academic specialists. Word of her extraordinary abilities spread throughout the intellectual networks that still connected the major cities of the Roman Empire, and students began making the dangerous journey to Alexandria specifically to study under her guidance. Her teaching methods represented a revolutionary departure from traditional pedagogical approaches. Where other instructors relied primarily on rote memorization and repetition of established doctrines, Hypatia encouraged her students to engage actively with the material, to question assumptions, and to discover mathematical and philosophical truths through their own reasoning processes. She would present a geometric theorem not as a finished product to be accepted on authority, but as a puzzle to be solved through careful logical analysis. Her students learned to construct their own proofs, to identify flawed reasoning, and to appreciate the elegant beauty that emerged when complex problems yielded to systematic thinking. The lecture hall where she taught, located within the ancient Serapeum that had once served as Alexandria's second great library, regularly overflowed with eager disciples. The diversity of her audience would have been remarkable in any age, but in the increasingly polarized religious climate of the late 4th century, it was nearly miraculous. Christians and pagans sat side by side, listening with equal fascination as she explored the mathematical relationships underlying musical harmony or demonstrated how geometric principles could illuminate the deepest questions of metaphysical philosophy. Her daily routine reflected the ancient ideal of cultivating both intellectual excellence and physical discipline. She would rise well before dawn, using the quiet hours before the city awakened to pursue her own research into mathematical problems that had puzzled scholars for generations. Her astronomical observations, recorded with meticulous precision, would later inform the calendar reforms attempted by various Christian emperors. Her mathematical innovations, particularly in the area of algebra and the solution of indeterminate equations, pushed the boundaries of what ancient mathematics could achieve. After morning prayers offered to the traditional gods, a practice that grew increasingly dangerous as Christianity consolidated its political and cultural dominance, she would spend several hours in concentrated mathematical work. This might involve checking the calculations in Ptolemy's astronomical tables, developing new methods for solving complex geometric problems, or working on her commentaries to the mathematical texts of Apollonius and Archimedes. Her mathematical instruments, precision devices of bronze and wood that she had learned to construct according to ancient specifications, filled her study with the gleaming tools of scientific investigation. Her afternoons belonged to her students, and it was here that Hypatia's true genius manifested itself most clearly. She possessed the rare ability to make abstract mathematical concepts accessible to minds not naturally inclined toward numerical thinking, while simultaneously challenging the most gifted students to push beyond conventional boundaries of understanding. Her lectures became famous throughout the scholarly world not merely for their intellectual content, but for the elegant clarity with which she could explain the most complex ideas. The evening gatherings in her home represented the culmination of Alexandria's ancient tradition of philosophical symposiums. These were not casual social occasions, but serious intellectual events where the most challenging questions of mathematics, astronomy, and metaphysics were explored through collaborative dialogue. Her house, decorated with geometric mosaics that illustrated mathematical principles and adorned with ancient sculptures representing the classical tradition of learning, provided the perfect setting for these discussions that often continued until dawn. Among the regular attendees at these evening gatherings was Orestes, the Roman prefect who governed Alexandria on behalf of the imperial administration. A highly educated man with genuine appreciation for learning, Orestes had become not merely Hypatia's student, but her devoted disciple, seeking her guidance on matters ranging from astronomical calculations to questions of ethical philosophy. Their intellectual relationship, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to rational inquiry, would eventually prove fatal to them both as the political climate of Alexandria grew increasingly hostile to such civilized discourse. But even as Hypatia's reputation reached its zenith, the world around her was changing in ways that would make her very existence impossible to sustain. The rise of militant Christianity under the leadership of Bishop Cyril had transformed Alexandria from a cosmopolitan center of learning into a battleground where faith and reason competed for supremacy. The Great Library, already diminished by centuries of neglect and periodic destruction, suffered further losses as Christian mobs destroyed texts they considered heretical or dangerous to Orthodox belief. The Serapeum itself, once the jewel of Hellenistic scholarship and the site where Hypatia delivered her lectures, had been ransacked by Christian zealots and converted into a church. Ancient statues of gods and heroes were smashed or melted down, replaced by Christian symbols that proclaimed the triumph of faith over the old pagan learning. Scrolls containing the works of classical authors were burned in public celebrations of Christianity's victory over what church leaders denounced as demonic deception disguised as wisdom. As the sole surviving representative of Alexandria's ancient intellectual tradition, Hypatia found herself increasingly isolated and vulnerable in this changing landscape. Her gender, which had made her remarkable in more tolerant times, now made her a perfect target for those who viewed learning itself with suspicion. In an age when Christian doctrine increasingly emphasized feminine silence and submission to male authority, her public teaching and scholarly authority represented a direct challenge to emerging religious orthodoxy. The conflict that would ultimately cost Hypatia her life began as what appeared to be a routine jurisdictional dispute between Orestes, the civil governor, and Bishop Cyril, who sought to expand ecclesiastical authority into areas traditionally controlled by secular administration. But this seemingly mundane political disagreement quickly transformed into a broader cultural battle between the rational, tolerant values represented by classical learning and the passionate, exclusive demands of militant religious faith. Orestes, influenced by his philosophical education and his reverence for his teacher Hypatia, resisted Cyril's attempts to subordinate civil authority to religious decree. This resistance was interpreted by the bishop and his followers not as legitimate defense of governmental prerogatives, but as evidence that the prefect had been corrupted by pagan influences, specifically by the malign intellectual sorcery they attributed to Hypatia's teaching. The rumors that began circulating through Alexandria's Christian community transformed Hypatia from a respected teacher into a figure of supernatural menace. Her mathematical instruments were reinterpreted as tools of divination and magical manipulation. Her astronomical observations were characterized as attempts to predict and control future events through demonic knowledge. Her evening philosophical discussions were portrayed as orgiastic gatherings where pagan mysteries corrupted both souls and bodies of those foolish enough to attend. These accusations, however absurd they might appear to rational analysis, carried deadly serious implications in the heated religious atmosphere of early 5th century Alexandria. The Parabolani, a Christian militia ostensibly organized to care for the sick and poor, but actually functioning as the bishop's private army, began gathering intelligence about Hypatia's movements and activities. Christian preachers delivered increasingly inflammatory sermons denouncing the dangers posed by pagan learning and those who continued to practice it. Hypatia was not blind to the growing danger surrounding her. She began varying her routes through the city, aware that hostile crowds might recognize her distinctive scholarly robes and subject her to verbal or even physical attack. Her students, sensing the changing mood, formed informal protective escorts, walking with her to and from the lecture hall in a pathetic attempt to shield their beloved teacher from the hatred that religious fanaticism had unleashed against everything she represented. The free exchange of ideas that had characterized her teaching throughout her career gave way to coded language and cautious glances as students and teacher alike recognized that philosophical discussion itself had become politically dangerous. Questions that had once been explored with eager curiosity were now approached with the wariness of people who understood that certain kinds of knowledge were no longer welcome in their changing world. Despite these mounting pressures, Hypatia refused to abandon her calling or compromise her intellectual integrity. She continued her mathematical research, working with desperate urgency on commentaries to the works of Apollonius and Ptolemy, knowing that these texts might soon be lost forever if not preserved in new editions that could survive the coming Dark Age. Each day of scholarly work might represent her final opportunity to save crucial knowledge for future generations who might once again value learning above dogma. Her mathematical legacy from this period reveals both her extraordinary competence and her tragic prescience about what was coming. The commentaries she produced on Apollonius's work on conic sections represented genuine advances in algebraic technique, while her editions of Ptolemy's astronomical tables included corrections based on her own observations of planetary positions. These were not merely academic exercises, but desperate attempts to preserve mathematical knowledge that might otherwise disappear entirely in the cultural catastrophe she could see approaching. On that final morning in March of 415, Hypatia prepared her lecture with particular care, perhaps sensing that this might be her last opportunity to share the wisdom she had spent a lifetime acquiring. She had chosen to speak about the relationship between mathematical harmony and divine order, a topic that bridged her scientific interests with her philosophical commitments, and that seemed especially urgent in an age when harmony of any kind was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. The lecture proceeded normally at first, with Hypatia demonstrating the elegant relationships between geometric forms and their algebraic expressions with the clarity and enthusiasm that had made her famous throughout the scholarly world. Her students, a mix of Christians and pagans united in their reverence for knowledge and their affection for their teacher, took careful notes as she revealed how mathematical principles reflected the underlying rational structure that gave order and meaning to the created universe. But even as she spoke, word was spreading through Alexandria's streets that the witch would be teaching that day. Peter the Lector, one of Bishop Cyril's most fanatical followers, had already begun assembling a mob of Parabolani, those Christian militants who had transformed from charitable workers into the violent enforcers of religious orthodoxy. These men, inflamed by months of inflammatory preaching about the dangers posed by pagan learning, were beyond the reach of rational argument or civilized restraint. When Hypatia left the lecture hall that afternoon, walking with the measured dignity that had characterized her entire career, she stepped directly into a moment that would symbolize the violent collision between ancient learning and medieval faith. The mob, armed with pottery shards and fueled by religious hatred, surrounded her chariot before she could reach the safety of her home. They dragged her from the vehicle with the systematic brutality of people who believed they were performing a sacred duty in service of their god. What followed was not merely murder, but the ritualistic destruction of everything Hypatia represented. They stripped away her scholar's robes, those white linen garments that had never before adorned a woman's body, but which had become her badge of intellectual authority. They scraped her flesh with oyster shells and pottery fragments, each wound serving as a blow against the rational inquiry she had devoted her life to advancing. Finally, they burned her mutilated body, ensuring that no physical trace would remain of Alexandria's last great philosopher. The aftermath of Hypatia's murder marked more than the end of one remarkable life. With her death, an entire tradition of learning that stretched back through centuries of accumulated wisdom came to its final, violent conclusion. She had been the last living link to the ancient world's greatest intellectual achievements, the final person capable of reading and understanding texts that would soon be lost forever to fire, neglect, or deliberate destruction. Her students scattered in the weeks following her assassination, carrying what knowledge they could preserve to distant corners of the empire where reason might still find shelter from the storm of religious fanaticism. Some fled to Constantinople, where secular learning enjoyed somewhat greater protection under imperial patronage. Others made their way to the monasteries of Ireland and Scotland, where Christian monks, ironically, would preserve classical texts that Christian mobs in Alexandria had marked for destruction. The mathematical instruments that had filled her study were destroyed as implements of diabolic divination. The astronomical tables she had spent years correcting were consigned to flames as documents of pagan sorcery. The philosophical manuscripts she had been preparing for future generations were lost in the orgy of destruction that followed her death, taking with them mathematical insights that would not be rediscovered for nearly 1,000 years. Yet Hypatia's legacy, though brutally interrupted, proved more durable than her persecutors could have imagined. Her mathematical commentaries, preserved by students who had fled Alexandria, eventually found their way to Islamic scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba, where they were translated, studied, and developed further by minds that could appreciate their value. Her teaching methods, emphasizing active student participation and rational inquiry, would eventually influence educational practices throughout the medieval Islamic world and, through Arabic translations, would help inspire the intellectual renaissance that would transform European universities in the 12th and 13th centuries. Most importantly, her example as a woman who had dared to claim intellectual authority in a world that denied such possibilities to her gender would inspire future generations of scholars who understood that the pursuit of knowledge sometimes requires extraordinary courage. In an age of growing darkness, she had maintained the light of reason until her final breath, proving that learning itself could become a form of martyrdom when faith and knowledge could no longer coexist peacefully. The empty lecture hall where she had taught for so many years stood as a silent monument to what had been lost in that moment of violence. The geometric diagrams that had covered its walls were whitewashed over, the mathematical instruments scattered or destroyed, the atmosphere of intellectual curiosity replaced by the oppressive silence of enforced orthodoxy. Alexandria would never again serve as a center of learning comparable to its ancient glory, and the Mediterranean world would enter a long twilight in which the very possibility of rational inquiry would survive only in scattered refuges far from the centers of religious and political power. Standing in that lecture hall one final time, preparing to share mathematical insights that had taken a lifetime to develop, Hypatia could not have known she was witnessing the end of an entire epoch of human intellectual achievement. But she faced that ending with the same dignity and commitment to truth that had characterized her extraordinary career, remaining faithful to the ideals of scholarship even when those ideals demanded the ultimate sacrifice. From the sunlit marble halls of ancient Alexandria, where knowledge met its violent end in religious fervor, our journey through history's educational mysteries carries us northward and forward through time, across the vast expanses of Eastern Europe to a land where winter reigns for half the year and secrets lie buried beneath layers of snow, earth, and accumulated centuries. Here, in the heart of Moscow, beneath the ancient red walls of the Kremlin, archaeologists and historians continue to search for what may be the most significant lost treasure in human intellectual history. Imagine, if you will, descending through the modern bustle of Red Square, past the tourist crowds and official ceremonies, down through carefully guarded basement levels, through medieval foundations, deeper still into chambers carved from solid bedrock by forgotten craftsmen working in an age when Moscow was transforming itself from a provincial principality into the heir of fallen Byzantium. Somewhere in these depths, according to centuries of tantalizing rumors and fragmentary evidence, lies a collection of manuscripts so vast and precious that its discovery would revolutionize our understanding of medieval culture, classical antiquity, and the lost intellectual heritage of the Eastern Orthodox world. This is the legendary Library of Ivan the Terrible, a library that may contain the rescued treasures of Constantinople's fallen empire, the mathematical works of Alexandria's scattered scholars, and philosophical texts that could fill the gaps left by centuries of warfare, fire, and deliberate destruction. Picture those last days of the Byzantine Empire, as Ottoman cannons battered the ancient walls and scholars worked frantically to preserve what they could of their intellectual heritage. The great libraries of Constantinople contain not merely books, but the accumulated wisdom of civilizations. Greek manuscripts preserving lost works of classical authors, Byzantine chronicles recording 1,000 years of Eastern Roman history, scientific treatises from the Islamic Golden Age, mathematical works from Alexandria's legendary museum, and philosophical texts that bridge the gap between ancient pagan wisdom and Christian metaphysics. As Mehmed II's armies closed in on the dying city, these precious manuscripts were sealed in specially constructed containers, crafted according to Byzantine traditions of manuscript preservation that had been refined over centuries of experience with the fragility of parchment and papyrus. These weren't simple wooden boxes, but sophisticated storage systems designed to protect their contents from moisture, fire, extreme temperatures, and the acidic effects of time itself. The containers were lined with materials that would absorb harmful gases, sealed with waxes that would repel water, and constructed with inner chambers that would cushion their contents against physical shock. The young woman who arrived in Moscow in 1472 carried with her not merely these physical treasures, but the knowledge required to preserve them properly. Yet despite generations of searching, despite the application of modern archaeological techniques and sophisticated detection equipment, these manuscripts remain as elusive as shadows, as mysterious as the paranoid czar who allegedly hid them away from a world he no longer trusted. The story begins not with Ivan himself, but with a marriage alliance that would reshape Russian culture in ways its participants could never have foreseen. In the year 1472, as Europe still reeled from the fall of Constantinople to Ottoman armies nearly 2 decades earlier, a remarkable young woman made the long, dangerous journey from Rome to Moscow, carrying with her not merely the bloodline of Byzantine emperors, but something far more precious and fragile, the scattered remnants of an intellectual tradition that stretched back through centuries of accumulated wisdom. Sophia Paleologina, niece of Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor to die defending the walls of Constantinople, had spent her youth in Italian exile, educated by Renaissance humanists who recognized in her both imperial dignity and exceptional intellectual gifts. But the treasures she brought to her marriage with Ivan III of Moscow went far beyond personal accomplishments. According to the fragmentary accounts that survive from this period, her dowry included something that would have been worth more than armies or gold to anyone who understood its true significance. Manuscripts rescued from the Great Library of Constantinople during the city's final, desperate hours. She had been educated in the Byzantine traditions of manuscript care, understood the delicate balance of temperature and humidity required to prevent deterioration, and possessed the linguistic skills necessary to catalog and organize texts written in Greek, Latin, Church Slavonic, and Arabic. More importantly, she grasped the immense historical significance of what she carried and was determined to ensure its preservation in her new homeland. Ivan III, known to history as Ivan the Great, initially showed little interest in his wife's scholarly treasures. He was a practical ruler focused on the concrete tasks of territorial expansion, military modernization, and the complex diplomatic maneuvering required to throw off the Mongol yoke that had dominated Russian politics for nearly 2.5 centuries. Books and manuscripts seemed irrelevant luxuries when compared to the urgent demands of state-building and warfare that consumed his daily attention. But Sophia possessed both patience and persuasive skill, and she gradually convinced her husband that these ancient texts represented something more than mere intellectual curiosities. They were symbols of imperial legitimacy, tangible proof that Moscow could claim inheritance of Rome's sacred authority through the direct succession of the Byzantine Empire. In an age when political power required religious and historical justification, these manuscripts offered something invaluable: documented evidence of cultural continuity stretching back through Constantinople to ancient Rome itself. Under Sophia's influence, Ivan III ordered the construction of special underground storage chambers beneath the Kremlin's foundations. These weren't simple cellars, but sophisticated repositories designed according to Byzantine principles that had been developed over centuries of manuscript preservation. Teams of craftsmen, many brought from Constantinople and Mount Athos, worked in secrecy to carve chambers from the solid bedrock beneath Moscow's citadel, creating spaces that would maintain the steady temperature and humidity levels essential for long-term manuscript survival. The construction of these underground libraries required extraordinary skill and attention to detail. The chambers were lined with specially treated oak that had been seasoned for years and treated with preservative compounds known only to Byzantine craftsmen. Ventilation systems, engineered according to principles developed in the monasteries of Mount Athos, ensured steady air circulation without dangerous temperature fluctuations. Drainage systems protected against water damage, while carefully designed access corridors allowed authorized personnel to reach the storage areas without exposing the manuscripts to harmful environmental changes. The project expanded dramatically under Ivan IV, the ruler history remembers as Ivan the Terrible. Despite his reputation for violence and psychological instability, Ivan IV possessed genuine intellectual curiosity and maintained one of the most extensive personal libraries of any medieval European ruler. He could read Latin, corresponded with scholars throughout Europe, and demonstrated sophisticated understanding of theology, philosophy, and statecraft. When he inherited his grandmother Sophia's manuscript collection, he recognized an opportunity to create something unprecedented in Russian history: a comprehensive repository of human knowledge that would rival the ancient library of Alexandria itself. Ivan IV's vision for his underground library extended far beyond the preservation of Byzantine manuscripts. He dispatched agents throughout Europe and the Middle East with instructions to acquire rare texts through purchase, diplomatic exchange, and when necessary, outright theft. These scholarly spies frequented the book markets of Venice and Constantinople, negotiated with monastery libraries in Prague and Vienna, and established networks of contacts among Jewish communities who had preserved Hebrew manuscripts through centuries of persecution and displacement. The catalog of acquisitions, if it ever existed in complete form, would read like a medieval scholar's impossible dream. Greek manuscripts containing lost plays of Sophocles and Euripides, known to modern scholars only through fragmentary quotations in later authors. Byzantine historical chronicles that could resolve centuries of scholarly debate about political developments in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Mathematical treatises from the Islamic Golden Age, containing algebraic and geometric insights that wouldn't be rediscovered in Western Europe until the Renaissance. Most tantalizing of all were the rumored Latin texts, potentially including genuine chronicles of early Roman history, complete copies of Tacitus' works considered lost forever, and even purported fragments of writings attributed to Julius Caesar himself. If these manuscripts truly existed and could be authenticated, they would represent an invaluable supplement to our understanding of classical antiquity, filling gaps in historical knowledge that have frustrated scholars since the Renaissance. The organization of Ivan's library followed sophisticated principles adapted from Byzantine and Islamic models. Manuscripts were sorted by subject matter, language, and historical period, with detailed catalogs recording not merely titles and authors, but also information about provenance, condition, and scholarly significance. Specially trained scribes, many recruited from the Orthodox monasteries of Mount Athos and Constantinople, were responsible for copying and maintaining the texts, working in carefully controlled conditions designed to minimize the risk of damage or deterioration. These scribes represented a remarkable convergence of traditions from across the Orthodox world. Greek monks brought expertise in preserving classical manuscripts, while Slavonic scholars contributed knowledge of vernacular texts and historical chronicles. Arabic-speaking Christians added skills in mathematical and scientific manuscripts, while Hebrew scholars assisted with texts in Judaic traditions. The result was a scholarly community capable of working with manuscripts in dozens of languages and spanning nearly 2 millennia of intellectual development. The daily routine of manuscript preservation in Ivan's underground library followed patterns established centuries earlier in the great libraries of Byzantium and Baghdad. Each morning, the temperature and humidity in the storage chambers were carefully measured and recorded, with adjustments made as necessary to maintain optimal conditions. Manuscripts were regularly inspected for signs of deterioration, with damaged texts immediately transferred to the scriptorium for copying and repair. The most precious items were stored in specially constructed cases, cushioned with silk and surrounded by materials designed to absorb harmful gases and moisture. But Ivan IV's increasing paranoia ultimately doomed this remarkable scholarly enterprise. As his mental state deteriorated during his later years, he became obsessed with protecting his treasures from enemies both real and imagined. Foreign diplomats who showed interest in Russian books were suspected of espionage. Scholars who requested access to particular texts were investigated for signs of treasonous intent. Even the librarians and scribes who worked daily with the manuscripts found themselves under constant surveillance, suspected of planning to steal or sabotage the collection they had devoted their lives to preserving. The Tsar's suspicions reached their climax in the 1570s and 1580s, as his mental condition continued to deteriorate and his fear of betrayal grew into consuming paranoia. Several of the library's custodians were executed on charges of planning to reveal its location to foreign agents. Others were tortured into confessing plots that existed only in the Tsar's diseased imagination. The scholarly community that had made the library's operation possible was systematically destroyed by the very ruler who had commissioned their work. As Ivan IV's death approached in 1584, he made the fateful decision to seal the library chambers completely, hiding them behind false walls and decoy passages that would confuse anyone attempting to locate the manuscripts after his death. The underground repositories were closed with massive stone blocks, their entrances concealed so effectively that even members of his immediate family were left ignorant of their precise locations. The detailed catalogs and organizational records that would have been essential for future scholars were either destroyed or hidden away in separate locations that died with Ivan himself. The time of troubles that followed Ivan's death saw Moscow occupied by foreign armies and the Kremlin itself ransacked by Polish and Swedish forces seeking treasure and strategic documents. Any surviving records of the library's whereabouts were likely destroyed in the chaos, and by the time the Romanov dynasty established political stability in the early 17th century, the underground manuscripts had already passed from documented fact into tantalizingly vague legend. The first systematic attempt to locate Ivan's lost library came during the reign of Peter the Great, who ordered excavations beneath the Kremlin as part of his broader campaign to modernize Russian society and institutions. These initial searches, conducted in the early 18th century, uncovered tantalizing hints of the library's existence. Fragments of ancient bindings, scraps of parchment with Greek and Latin text, and sealed chambers that had clearly once contained valuable materials. But the excavations were abandoned when Peter's attention turned to more pressing military concerns, and no major manuscript discoveries emerged from these preliminary efforts. Soviet-era investigations, conducted with greater systematic rigor and more sophisticated equipment, revealed extensive tunnel networks beneath the Kremlin that dated to Ivan IV's reign. Ground-penetrating radar detected numerous sealed chambers, some containing organic materials consistent with stored manuscripts. Chemical analysis of soil samples revealed traces of materials used in medieval ink production and manuscript preservation. Most intriguingly, fragments of specially treated leather and parchment suggested that manuscripts had indeed been stored in these underground spaces for extended periods. Yet the manuscripts themselves remained elusive, hidden behind stone barriers that archaeologists were reluctant to breach without clear evidence of what lay beyond. Some chambers showed signs of having been deliberately emptied, their contents removed with careful precision rather than destroyed by fire or water damage. Others appeared to have been sealed for centuries but contained only empty storage containers, as if their most precious contents had been relocated to even more secure hiding places as Ivan's paranoia reached its final, destructive crescendo. The most promising modern search began in the 1990s under the direction of Apollos Ivanov, a Moscow archaeologist who had spent decades studying 16th-century construction techniques and manuscript preservation methods. Ivanov's team combined traditional archaeological methods with advanced technology, using fiber optic cameras to explore sealed spaces without risking damage to potential manuscript finds, and employing chemical analysis to detect the presence of materials used in medieval book production. Their discoveries were both encouraging and frustrating. They identified several previously unknown underground chambers that matched historical descriptions of Ivan's library storage systems. They found sophisticated ventilation systems designed to maintain steady environmental conditions. They detected chemical signatures consistent with ancient inks, parchments, and binding materials. But the manuscripts themselves continued to elude discovery, hidden behind barriers that modern technology could detect but not safely breach. Recent technological advances have renewed hope among researchers seeking to solve this archaeological puzzle. Ground-penetrating radar systems can now detect organic materials at unprecedented resolution and depth. Fiber optic cameras with improved lighting and image resolution allow detailed exploration of sealed spaces. Most significantly, new chemical analysis techniques can identify the presence of specific types of ancient manuscripts even when no visible traces remain, distinguishing between different types of parchment, ink compositions, and binding materials with remarkable precision. The implications of discovering Ivan's library extend far beyond Russian cultural history. Byzantine manuscripts could illuminate the lost centuries between the fall of Rome and the rise of the Islamic empires, providing crucial information about political, religious, and intellectual developments that remain obscure to modern historians. Classical texts might resolve scholarly debates that have persisted since the Renaissance, offering new insights into ancient philosophy, literature, and science. This is education through performance, knowledge acquired through the endless repetition of rituals that teach, more effectively than any textbook, the fundamental inequalities that govern human society. Your own preparation for this morning's lessons began at 4 o'clock in the cramped apartment you occupy in the palace's upper floors. These rooms, for which you pay enormous sums to the royal household, would barely qualify as servants' quarters in your ancestral chateau, yet they represent the highest privilege attainable by most of France's ancient nobility. The thin walls ensure that your private conversations might be overheard by rivals, while the shared corridors and common facilities force constant encounters with courtiers whose favor or enmity could determine your family's fortunes for generations to come. Your valet, a man whose expertise in the subtle arts of court fashion represents years of specialized training, has spent 2 hours arranging your appearance according to specifications more precise than any military uniform. The silk stockings that encase your legs must be perfectly smooth, without a single wrinkle that might offend the royal eye or suggest carelessness in the sacred duty of personal presentation. Your justicorps, that long coat which marks your noble status, must be brushed to perfection, each button polished to mirror brightness, every thread examined for signs of wear that would indicate declining fortune or insufficient attention to the demands of courtly propriety. Most critically, your powdered wig must be arranged in the exact style currently favored by His Majesty, a fashion that changes with bewildering frequency and requires constant attention from expensive specialists who understand the political significance of every curl and wave. The wrong choice of hairstyle could signal dangerous independence of mind, while failure to adopt new fashions quickly enough suggests either poverty or provincial ignorance, both fatal flaws in an environment where appearance constitutes the primary language of political communication. The financial burden of maintaining this elaborate costume approaches the crushing weight of military taxation. A single court-appropriate outfit costs more than most French peasants earn in several years of backbreaking agricultural labor. You employ a small army of servants whose sole responsibility involves maintaining your wardrobe, and you must constantly purchase new clothing to avoid the social death that would result from appearing unfashionable or, worse yet, wearing the same ensemble twice in public view. As you make your way through the palace's labyrinthine corridors toward the king's apartments, you navigate a complex geography of status and privilege where every room, every staircase, every hallway has its own unwritten rules governing who may use it and under what circumstances. The Grand Escalier, that magnificent main staircase which serves as one of Versailles' architectural marvels, remains reserved for courtiers holding specific offices or enjoying particular royal favor. Lesser nobles must use side passages and secondary staircases, timing their movements carefully to avoid accidentally encountering someone of significantly higher rank who might interpret their presence as presumptuous or disrespectful. The Hall of Mirrors, that glittering symbol of French magnificence which stretches for nearly 240 feet along the palace's garden facade, serves as the building's main thoroughfare, but traversing its length requires careful choreography that would challenge a professional dancer. You must acknowledge each person you encounter according to their exact position in the court's elaborate hierarchy, with precisely calibrated bows, nods, and verbal greetings that demonstrate your mastery of the complex mathematics of precedence and protocol. A bow that goes too deep for someone of lower rank marks you as either ignorant or servile, while insufficient deference to a superior can trigger social catastrophes that might require months or years to repair. The morning's first and most important lesson takes place in the king's antechamber, where you join perhaps 300 other courtiers in the daily ritual known as the Lever du Roi, the Royal Awakening. Your position in this crowded room reflects your current standing in the endless calculations of court favor, with those closest to the bedroom door enjoying the highest status, while lesser nobles crowd toward the back walls, straining to catch glimpses of the ceremony that will determine the day's political atmosphere. This is education in its most distilled form, though no professor would recognize it as such. Here you learn, through direct observation and painful experience, the fundamental principles that govern hierarchical society. You study the precise gradations of power that separate duke from marquis, marquis from count, count from baron, and baron from the untitled gentlemen who occupy the lowest rungs of noble society. You memorize the complex rules that determine precedence in everything from seating arrangements to conversational protocol, and you practice the delicate art of advancing your own interests while appearing to serve only the greater glory of the crown. The ceremony itself unfolds with religious precision, each element refined through decades of practice into a perfect expression of royal majesty and aristocratic submission. When the king's first valet de chambre enters the sacred bedchamber and whispers, "Sire, it is time," Louis XIV, who has been awake for some time but remained motionless in his massive bed, now graciously permits the ritual to commence. The doors open, and a carefully selected group of the highest-ranking courtiers enters the Holy of Holies, where the body of the king will be transformed from mere flesh into the visible symbol of divine authority. Mathematical and scientific works could reveal forgotten advances that might have accelerated human intellectual development by centuries if they had remained accessible to later scholars. Perhaps most significantly, the library might contain unique copies of texts known only from later transcriptions, allowing scholars to study works in their original form without the accumulated errors and editorial modifications that inevitably resulted from centuries of copying. Medieval scribes, despite their best efforts, often introduced changes as they worked, and these modifications accumulated over generations until the surviving versions of ancient texts sometimes bore only distant resemblance to their original forms. The search for Ivan's library continues today, hampered by political sensitivities surrounding excavations beneath one of the world's most secure government facilities and the practical difficulties of conducting archaeological research in an active administrative center. Each new season of investigation brings fresh hope and renewed frustration as researchers uncover more evidence of the library's existence, while the manuscripts themselves remain tantalizingly beyond reach. Modern scholars work with the understanding that time itself is their enemy. Even if the manuscripts survived Ivan's paranoid concealment efforts, paper and parchment continue to deteriorate despite the most sophisticated preservation techniques available to 16th-century craftsmen. Chemical processes that began centuries ago continue their slow work of destruction, and each passing year reduces the likelihood that any significant texts have survived in readable condition. Yet the possibility that such a treasure trove of human knowledge might still exist, waiting in darkness beneath one of the world's most famous buildings, continues to drive archaeologists, historians, and treasure hunters to pursue what might prove to be the most significant manuscript discovery in human history. The very uncertainty surrounding the library's fate has become part of its allure, transforming a scholarly investigation into something approaching a spiritual quest for lost wisdom. Whether Ivan the Terrible's library still lies hidden in some forgotten chamber beneath the Kremlin, or whether its contents were destroyed centuries ago by fire, flood, or deliberate sabotage, remains one of archaeology's most compelling unsolved mysteries. The search itself has become a testament to humanity's enduring hunger for knowledge and our willingness to pursue wisdom even when the odds of success seem vanishingly small. In the pursuit of these phantom manuscripts, modern scholars recapitulate the same passion for learning that drove ancient collectors to risk everything in the preservation of human intellectual achievement. From the mysterious depths beneath Moscow's ancient walls, where scholars still search for Ivan's vanished treasures, our exploration of history's strangest educational landscapes carries us westward and forward through time, across the vast plains of Eastern Europe, through the Germanic forests and the fertile valleys of France, to a palace that represents the ultimate refinement of learning transformed into performance, knowledge subordinated to power, and education itself remade as an elaborate ritual of submission and display. Picture, if you will, the pre-dawn darkness of a winter morning in the year 1685, in the most magnificent building that human ambition and royal treasury have ever combined to create. Versailles stretches before you like a marble dream made manifest, its countless windows reflecting the pale light of stars that will soon fade before the rising sun. Somewhere within these endless corridors and chambers, behind doors gilded with more gold than entire kingdoms possess, the most elaborate educational ritual in European history is about to begin. You are a duke, holder of ancient titles that stretch back through centuries of noble lineage. Yet this morning you feel more like a schoolchild approaching examination than a man whose ancestors commanded armies and governed provinces. For life at the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, has transformed every social interaction into a lesson in hierarchy, every meal into instruction in submission, every moment of the day into careful training in the precise choreography of absolute monarchy. The education you receive here bears no resemblance to the formal curricula of universities or the systematic instruction of traditional academies. Instead, you learn through immersion in a world where every gesture carries meaning, every word must be calculated for its political implications, and every breath you take serves to reinforce the divine nature of royal authority. The thin walls ensure that confidential conversations might be overheard by rivals seeking advantage, while the shared corridors and common facilities force additional encounters with courtiers whose friendship or enmity could influence your fortunes in unpredictable ways. Sleep itself becomes another challenge in this environment where every action carries political significance and educational potential. Your servants must maintain perfect silence to avoid disturbing neighboring nobles who might complain to higher authorities, yet they must also remain prepared to respond instantly to any summons from courtiers of superior rank who might require immediate service or assistance. The palace's heating system, designed more for architectural grandeur than practical comfort, leaves your chambers alternately stifling hot during summer months and numbingly cold throughout the long winter season. Even your dreams, when sleep finally comes, remain haunted by the complex protocols and social calculations that dominate waking hours at Versailles. You find yourself rehearsing conversations that might advance your interests, reviewing slides that require careful response, and planning strategies for navigating the next day's social and political challenges. The constant pressure of maintaining your current position while seeking gradual advancement transforms every aspect of existence into an elaborate performance, where mistakes might carry consequences affecting your family's fortunes for generations to come. This magnificent prison of protocol and privilege represents the ultimate refinement of aristocratic education, where the simple acts of daily life become elaborate rituals expressing the fundamental inequalities that govern human society in its most stratified form. Every moment spent within these marble halls reinforces the lesson that luxury and political power come at costs extending far beyond financial expense, demanding the sacrifice of personal authenticity, private space, and genuine human connection on the altar of social ambition and political advancement. The education you receive at Versailles teaches no practical skills that would prove useful in agriculture, commerce, or military service. Instead, it provides intensive training in the arts of ceremonial submission, competitive consumption, and the precise calculation of social advantage within rigidly hierarchical systems. You learn to read the subtle signals that indicate shifting political currents, to manage complex networks of obligation and alliance, and to present yourself as simultaneously humble before authority and superior to those below you in the great chain of being that stretches from peasant to king. Yet this strange curriculum, however artificial it might appear to modern eyes, serves genuine educational purposes in preparing its students for the specific challenges of aristocratic life under absolute monarchy. The courtiers who master these elaborate lessons go on to govern provinces, command armies, negotiate international treaties, and manage the complex administrative systems that hold the kingdom together. The skills they acquire at Versailles, the ability to read human nature, to navigate complex social hierarchies, to balance competing interests and demands, prove essential in the practical exercise of political authority. The irony embedded in this system reveals itself most clearly in quiet moments between the day's ceremonies, when you might catch glimpses of the human cost extracted by this relentless pursuit of refinement and control. Fellow courtiers, despite their magnificent costumes and elaborate social graces, often display signs of the psychological strain imposed by constant performance and competition. Behind the powdered faces and brilliant smiles, you can sometimes detect the exhaustion, anxiety, and barely suppressed desperation of people who have sacrificed their authentic selves for the possibility of advancement in a system that offers no guarantees and tolerates no weakness. The sun setting behind Versailles' western windows casts long shadows across the Hall of Mirrors, illuminating for brief moments the faces of men and women who have devoted their lives to mastering the most sophisticated educational system ever created for the production of perfect courtiers. In their carefully controlled expressions, their precisely calculated gestures, and their unwavering attention to the demands of etiquette and protocol, you can see both the triumph of human social engineering and its profound limitations. They have learned everything necessary to succeed in this artificial world, yet their success has come at the price of almost everything that might make life worth living outside these gilded walls. Tomorrow will bring another day of the same elaborate lessons, another opportunity to advance or fail in the great competition for royal favor, another chance to demonstrate mastery of the complex curriculum that transforms human beings into perfectly functioning components of the most absolute monarchy Europe has ever witnessed. The education continues, relentless and comprehensive, shaping minds and souls in the image of a political system that demands nothing less than the complete subordination of individual will to the greater glory of the state and its earthly representative, the king who sits at the center of this vast web of ceremony, competition, and controlled human performance. As we reach the end of our journey through history's strangest educational landscapes, let yourself settle more deeply into comfort, feeling the weight of centuries lifting from your shoulders like a heavy cloak finally removed after a long day's travel. We have witnessed learning in forms that would seem impossible to our modern world. Education through induced hallucinations, knowledge pursued at the cost of life itself, wisdom hidden in underground chambers, and truth transformed into elaborate social performance. From the ergot-laced gruel of Eleusinian initiates to the gilded protocols of Versailles, from Hypatia's tragic martyrdom for mathematical truth to Ivan's paranoid concealment of scholarly treasures. These stories remind us that the pursuit of knowledge has always been both humanity's greatest achievement and its most dangerous obsession. Every action that follows has been choreographed to demonstrate the sacred nature of royal power and the privilege inherent in serving that power, however indirectly. The king's nightshirt is removed by the Grand Chamberlain, assisted by the first gentleman of the bedchamber, positions of such honor that great nobles compete with vicious determination for the privilege of handling the royal undergarments. Each piece of clothing is presented by a different courtier according to strict precedence. The shirt by one duke, the stockings by another, the justicorps by a third, each garment representing another step in the daily recreation of monarchy itself. You observe these proceedings with the intense concentration of a scholar studying sacred texts, because every gesture, every word, every slight variation in the established routine carries potential significance for your own political fortunes. When the king pauses before selecting which sword to wear with his costume, his choice might signal shifting alliances in the complex web of European diplomacy. When he comments favorably on a particular courtier's appearance, it could indicate rising favor that might translate into lucrative government appointments or advantageous marriage alliances for that person's children and dependents. This morning ritual concludes with the king's prayers, conducted in Latin by his confessor, while the assembled courtiers maintain reverent silence that serves as yet another lesson in the proper relationship between subjects and sovereign. This moment of supposed spiritual reflection provides additional opportunities for political calculation, as you note which courtiers appear most devout, which seem distracted by worldly concerns, and how the king himself responds to different prayers and biblical passages. Even divine worship becomes a form of courtly education, teaching through example the proper subordination of all earthly powers to royal authority blessed by heaven itself. Following the lever, the court disperses to pursue the day's scheduled activities, each governed by protocols as rigid and meaningful as those surrounding the royal awakening. Breakfast, for those wealthy enough to afford the elaborate meals required by court standards, consists of exotic delicacies prepared by specialized chefs and served on porcelain worth more than entire villages. The chocolate, coffee, and tropical fruits that grace noble tables represent the wealth extracted from France's growing global empire, but consuming them requires mastering complex rules about proper preparation and presentation that transforms simple eating into another form of aristocratic education. The morning's entertainment might include participation in the royal hunt, an activity that appears recreational but serves crucial educational functions in the political curriculum of court life. Invitations to join these expeditions are distributed according to current favor, and your inclusion or exclusion sends unmistakable signals about your standing in the king's estimation. During the hunt itself, even the positioning of horses and the timing of shots must follow established hierarchies, with His Majesty always claiming the most prestigious kills regardless of which courtier's skill actually brought down the quarry. For those not invited to participate in the hunt, the morning might be devoted to the elaborate ritual of paying visits to other courtiers, social calls that follow intricate patterns of obligation and reciprocity refined through generations of practice. Careful attention must be paid to the duration of each visit, the topics of conversation deemed appropriate, and the gifts or compliments exchanged as tokens of respect and friendship. Failing to visit someone who expects your attention, or presuming to call upon someone who doesn't welcome your presence, can trigger cascading social disasters that might require years to repair and could permanently damage your family's position at court. The afternoon brings fresh ceremonies and new opportunities for both advancement and humiliation in the ongoing education that shapes every aspect of court existence. The king's dinner, served in public according to ancient traditions that transform eating into theater, requires yet another complex choreography of service and observation. Hundreds of courtiers crowd into the dining room to watch Louis XIV consume each course, commenting appropriately on the quality of the food and the elegance of the presentation while learning, through this daily repetition, that even the most private functions of royal life serve public purposes in the maintenance of absolute authority. Your own meals present constant challenges that combine financial expense with social education. Dining at court requires maintaining a table sufficiently lavish to accommodate sudden visits from higher-ranking nobles, but the cost of appropriate food and service places crushing strain on budgets already stretched by the demands of courtly dress and housing. The wine alone, which must meet standards set by royal taste and cannot fall below the quality served at the king's own table, costs more each month than your ancestors spent on their entire provincial households. Evening entertainment varies according to the monarch's mood and the political requirements of any given moment, but always serves educational purposes in the great curriculum of absolute monarchy. Musical performances by the court's renowned composers and virtuoso performers provide opportunities for displaying cultural sophistication, but they also require demonstrating appropriate levels of appreciation and understanding. Applauding too enthusiastically, or at the wrong moment, marks you as provincial and insufficiently refined, while displays of insufficient appreciation suggest dangerous indifference to royal taste and preference. The gambling that typically follows these cultural presentations serves as another arena for political maneuvering disguised as entertainment. The stakes at the royal card tables are deliberately set at levels that ensure only the wealthiest courtiers can participate meaningfully, while the king's own play is carefully observed for signs of favor or displeasure toward individual participants. Winning too much money from His Majesty risks accusations of cheating or disrespect, while losing too heavily suggests financial weakness that might disqualify you from consideration for lucrative government positions or profitable marriage alliances. Your evenings often extend well past midnight, as social obligations leave little time for genuine rest or private contemplation. Intimate conversations conducted in dimly lit alcoves might yield crucial intelligence about shifting alliances or upcoming appointments, but they also carry the risk of exposure to dangerous intrigues that could result in exile from court or even imprisonment. The same whispered discussions that might advance your career could just as easily destroy it if you misjudge the loyalties and ambitions of your conversation partners. Even the act of retiring to your apartments provides little relief from the day's accumulated stresses and educational pressures. Your rooms, cramped and expensive, offer barely adequate space for the private activities necessary to maintain your public persona, and they prove entirely insufficient for entertaining other nobles in the style that court society demands. The ancient mystery schools taught cosmic truths through systematic dissolution of ordinary consciousness. Hypatia maintained the light of classical learning until violent ignorance extinguished it forever. Somewhere beneath Moscow's foundations, the rescued wisdom of fallen Byzantium may still wait in darkness for rediscovery. At Versailles, learning itself became a tool of political control, transforming education into theater and knowledge into power. Each of these strange schools, in its own way, reveals profound truths about the human hunger for understanding and the lengths to which both teachers and students have always been willing to go in pursuit of wisdom. Whether through chemical alteration of consciousness, intellectual martyrdom, scholarly obsession, or social performance, our ancestors sought knowledge with intensity that modern education, for all its systematic efficiency, rarely matches. Perhaps there is something both comforting and unsettling in recognizing how different our own educational experiences have been from these historical extremes. We learn in safety, without risking madness or death, without underground chambers or elaborate court ceremonies. Our textbooks arrive without ergot contamination. Our professors face no religious mobs. Our libraries exist in the open air rather than sealed beneath stone blocks. Our classrooms require no powdered wigs or calculated bows. Yet in that very safety, we might wonder what has been lost as well as gained. The ancient initiates, for all their suffering, touched realms of consciousness that remain largely unexplored by conventional pedagogy. Hypatia, despite her tragic end, achieved integration of mathematical precision with philosophical wisdom that few scholars have matched. Ivan's librarians, however paranoid their patron, preserved knowledge with dedication that puts modern digital storage to shame. Even the courtiers of Versailles, for all their artificiality, mastered social skills that governed international politics for generations. Let these thoughts drift gently through your mind as you prepare for sleep, like leaves floating downstream toward peaceful darkness. The struggles and achievements of these ancient educators and students have become part of the great river of human experience that flows beneath all our contemporary concerns and daily worries. Their obsessions with cosmic truth, their willingness to risk everything for learning, their elaborate methods and extreme measures, all have contributed to the vast accumulation of knowledge and wisdom from which we benefit today, usually without awareness of the extraordinary costs at which it was originally acquired. Rest now in the comfortable certainty that knowledge, however it has been pursued through history's strangest classrooms, continues its patient work of illumination, no longer requiring the desperate measures of ages past, but always carrying within it the same essential human yearning to understand, to learn, and to discover the deeper truths that give meaning to our brief existence in this mysterious universe. Sleep well, knowing that the long story of human learning continues, and that your own small part in that vast educational project links you to every seeker of knowledge who has ever lived, from the most humble student to the most brilliant teacher, from the most ancient mystery school to the most modern classroom. The lessons end, but the learning never truly stops. It only changes form, like water becoming mist, mist becoming clouds, clouds becoming rain that nourishes new growth in an endless cycle of wisdom seeking wisdom, consciousness exploring consciousness, until all questions find their answers in the peaceful silence of understanding. Sleep well.